the problem with trying to quantify, measure the amounts of good and evil that's in the world is a hopeless project. We can't, and you mentioned evil God a moment ago. There's this popular challenge in philosophy of religion that says, look at all the good and evil in the world. Who's to say that God is good rather than evil? And that's the essence of that challenge. And it works because it's really hard to quantify these things, especially when you're not just counting pains, pleasures, happinesses and the like, but you're also seeing what goods and bads they ultimately lead to. You can play that game all day long. But there's one thing that the anti-antinatalist has up their sleeve, and that's to say that existence itself is intrinsically good. Existence and being sit at the top of Jacob's ladder. That given the choice, and take John Rawls, you mentioned Marx, let's use another lefty-looking political figure in political theory. John Rawls said, imagine you're behind this veil of ignorance and you've got to create the world. And we can change this a bit for the purposes of our discussion. Now, you're given the choice whether to bring in life and conscious beings and not. You don't know how much happiness, pain, pleasure they're going to experience, how much suffering they're going to experience when they're in the world. And he asks, well, we're asking on behalf of Rawls, would you bring things into being still, not knowing how much happiness and suffering they'd experience? I think we'd all say yes still. I think there is no person that I know of anyway that legitimately defends the intrinsic disvalue of life. Even David Benatar, the most prominent antinatalist, doesn't think that life is intrinsically bad. He thinks that the suffering and pain in the world overrides the intrinsic goodness of the world. And I think that is ultimately something that goes in the antinatalist's favor.
So, okay. So I guess my first response to that question to you as well is that it isn't obvious to me that the axis of happiness and suffering is the right axis of evaluation. We seem to believe that it's self-evident that it's, let's say, something approximating pleasure versus pain. But that is not the only, what would you say? That those aren't the only interpretive frameworks that are accessible. So I'll give you an example, a biblical example, which I think deals with this point extremely well. And so the first great hero of the biblical texts is Abraham. And you could think of Abraham as the expression of Seth, who's the third son of Adam and Eve, right? So you have the battle between Cain and Abel. Abel dies, and Seth is his replacement. If you were searching for the spirit of Seth, it would be Abraham. Okay, so here's what happens to Abraham. It's very, very interesting. So we're presented with Abraham at the start of his story, but he's an old man already. And he is a man who's lived a life that hasn't been characterized by suffering. So he has the socialist paradise at hand, in a sense, because Abraham is the child of wealthy parents. And there's not a lot of biographical information in the text, but what we do know is that whatever Abraham wanted, he got. And that was sufficiently, like Buddha, before Buddha is struck down by knowledge of death and mortality. Abraham's in the same situation. It's the situation of childhood paradise. That's a good way of thinking about it, unconscious childhood paradise. Now, God comes to Abraham in a very specific form. And God comes to Abraham as the voice that compels him to leave his security and voyage into the world. And that's precisely the instruction, is that Abraham is to leave his kin and the security of his wealthy father's dwelling and to go out into the terrible world. And it is a terrible world because Abraham has a very cataclysmic adventure. War, tyranny, famine, like sexual conflict, deep sexual immortality, the requirement for profound sacrifice. Like Abraham has a life, and it's not hedonic. Okay, so then you might say, well, if the solution to life's conundrums isn't pleasure as opposed to pain, because that's what Abraham has to begin with, what exactly is on offer? Okay, so God makes Abraham a deal. This is the covenant, by the way. He makes him a very specific deal. He says, if you hearken to the voice that compels you outward, that takes you from your zone of comfort, you can think about that as the voice of adventure. 4 things will happen to you. You'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal, right? So you're not living in misery. Now, your life isn't pleasure and the absence of pain. Now it's characterized as something approximating a blessing. You'll do that in a way that will make your name validly renowned among your fellows. You will do that in a manner that enables you to establish a dynasty of permanence, and you'll do it in a way that's a blessing to everyone else. Now, imagine for a second, tell me what you think about this, because there's a real technical claim here. So, children have to move beyond the zone of comfort provided to them by their parents. They have to move out into the terrible world. All right, so, and there's an instinct that compels them forward that encouraging parents admire and foster. Go out. Now, that parents know that their children are going to be hurt by the world, but they want to make them competent. Now, what God offers in the Abrahamic story isn't pleasure, and it's certainly not the absence of pain. It's something like noble romantic adventure. And that's way different. That's a way different vision. And it's an interesting vision, even if you think about fiction and entertainment, because the entertainment forms that people prefer aren't representations of the absence of pain or of hedonic gratification. They're almost always representations of romantic adventure. And so I'll just add one more thing to that, because it also addresses something else you pointed out. And this is the idea that God wouldn't produce a world where evil could reign in the manner that it does. But I would say, I'm not so sure about that, because there's a serious insistence in the biblical text, for example, that what human beings have to do is vital and real.
Yeah.
Right? It's not some sideshow. And what that implies is that if you do things correctly, there will be spectacularly positive consequences, let's say, and maybe unimaginably spectacular consequences. But if you do things wrong, like there's no bottom to the abyss. Now that's a very demanding world. But I don't know, like you think about your own kids, like you want to set a challenge in front of them. And if you wanted to challenge someone to be everything they could be, if they were everything they could be, then would the challenge have those archetypal poles of hell and heaven? I mean, that is how the world appears to be constituted. Depressed people are sad and frustrated and disappointed. They tend to feel all negative emotions simultaneously in a manner that's paralyzing. You take the problem, I'm suffering, and then you think, well, why are you suffering? And then you can practice encountering the obstacles that are stopping you, and it'll make you braver, and it'll help you deal with your problems.
This is good. I think ultimately, though, all of those points are sound within a theistic framework, which we already need to have, right? If God exists, or if it's reasonable to take the leap of faith and believe in God, then it's reasonable to think that God has a plan for you and that your life is meaningful despite the pain and the suffering you experience. There is value to Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life when he
or in consequence, not despite even. Right?
Yeah.
Not despite.
In consequence. Good.
Well, could be,
Yeah. So it seems like a meaningful and fulfilling life is probably more important than having hedonistic pleasures for the Abrahamic believer. I believe that's completely the right way of thinking about it. But it's a very different thing for the agnostic or the secular philosopher who can't appeal to cosmic meaning. You have the benefit of cashing out all of these other things in God's ultimate plan and your ultimate destiny. But the agnostic doesn't get that. I mean, you can have things that are like that, right? You can have like an Aristotelian view where fulfilling your natural end is what's good. Martha Nussbaum defends a version of this in a book, Justice for Animals, which I've just finished. And she says, there are creatures all over the world that want to reproduce and play and grow and all of these things. She says, thwarting those ends would be bad. Even if you snuck up and gave them the bullet in the back of the head and they didn't know you're about to kill them and they didn't suffer, it would still be bad because the dog buried his bone yesterday and can't get it tomorrow, and you're taking that thing away from that entity. That can't be understood within a framework of hedonistic utilitarianism, such as that defended by Peter Singer. the hedonistic utilitarian wants to say that the things that I am fulfilled in doing, the purpose that I reach, has to create more happiness and pleasure for entities as a whole than it does pain and suffering. It has to cash out at that. So I think within this Abrahamic view that you've developed there, and which seems to be your view, is that, yeah, meaning and purpose is more important than hedonistic pleasure and happiness. But for the agnostic and the atheist, I think we've got a bit more of a challenge on our hands. We need to find a ground for that morality.
Okay, well, thing is, I actually think that that's not only possible, but inevitable in a sense, So what's the quote by Christ is, I am the truth. I am the way and the truth and the life. I believe no one comes to the Father except through me. That's a technical description in a sense. Yeah. I think, well, okay, so you could take that apart and let's do that for a moment. And so the way is a pathway forward. It's a road. And so the best possible road leads to the best possible destination. And part of what you perceive, literally what you perceive, is a road. Like we see pathways. We see tools, we see obstacles, we see friends, we see foes. But what we see is a pathway. Okay, now the question is, what's the pathway? Now, we described it earlier in terms of Jacob's ladder, and that's a reasonable way of conceptualizing it. But then you might say, well, how do you find the golden pathway? And this would be a question for atheists and agnostics as well. And one answer to that is you tell the truth. And then these other realizations, revelations, let's say, come to you. You could say you tell the truth in relationship to the upward aim. That's another useful way of conceptualizing it. And so I don't think that realization is out of reach for the atheists or the agnostics unless they proclaim verbally, procedurally, that's not the right word. Verbally, let's say, explicitly, that this higher order transcendent reality that transcends even being is